Mr. President, thank you very much for your invitation and this opportunity to address the European Parliament. I have been a parliamentarian in my own country for 23 years, and during 3 I was with your neighbours of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. So allow me to say, dear colleagues, the United Nations was created after the Second World War exactly because the world wanted to avoid another tragedy of the same dimension. But I believe this was exactly the main motivation for the creation of the European communities, with one very important difference, that the European communities and the European Union are clearly the most successful project of peace sustainability in the world since the beginning of history. And that is why I want to express here my very deep gratitude and appreciation for the strong commitment of the European Union and all its bodies to multilateralism, and for the very generous and extremely important contribution you give in development cooperation, in humanitarian aid, and also in the key central aspects of peace and security that are the core of the United Nations action. You see the European Union involved around Libya. You see the European Union involved funding the AMISOM mission of the African Union in Somalia. We see the European Union in both financial support and training in situations from Central African Republic or Mali, and we're looking forward the support of the European Union for the initiative of the neighbours of Mali, the G5 Sahel. European contribution is today an absolutely essential part of what is necessary to make the UN effective. And I want to express my deep gratitude for that. Dear colleagues, it would be possible to come here and make the case that the world has never been better. And it is obvious that globalization and technological progress have, in the last decades, created the conditions for an enormous increase in global wealth, for a meaningful improvement in the living conditions of the majority of the population, even for a very strong reduction of the number of absolute poor, probably the Chinese contribution being essential for that. And some might even say, looking, for instance, at the number of soldiers killed in the battlefield, that this is the most period peaceful in human history. Now, these indicators might be true, but they are far from revealing the whole truth. And I think it is important for us to recognize that we are facing a number of unprecedented challenges that require the EU and the UN to work together. Allow me to mention briefly 4 of them. First, conflict. We are seeing a multiplication of new conflicts in the last few years, and old conflicts seem never to die, be it in Afghanistan or Somalia or the Democratic Republic of Congo. But the truth is that not only we have a multiplication of conflicts, but they change in nature. We practically no longer have wars between countries, even if there are some threats looming at the horizon. But most of the conflicts are internal, many of them linked to fragilities in the countries, but being internal, they quickly become a regional, have a regional dimension, and sometimes even a global dimension. At the same time, they tend to be asymmetric, more and more complex, more and more interlinked, and more linked with the threat, the new threat of global terrorism in the world. If one looks at the situation from Nigeria to Mali, to Libya, to Somalia, to Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Afghanistan, all these conflicts are becoming more and more interlinked. You see fighters going from one to another, and then some of them going back to their countries of origin and potentially becoming elements, threats to the security of those countries of origin. And we see these conflicts becoming more and more interlinked. They are indeed today a very relevant threat to our global security wherever we live. And at the same time, it is clear that power relations in the world became less obvious, and with power relations less obvious, it seems that there is no respect, and impunity and unpredictability became the name of the game. Now, in this context, when one looks at the present trends of conflict, it is absolutely essential to create the conditions to revert this trend. And for that, it is clear we need to strengthen multilateral capacity to address conflicts, to solve conflicts, and to prevent and sustain peace. And this is an area where the European cooperation with the United Nations is absolutely crucial. We need to strengthen our own capacity to solve many of the conflicts around the world. But that forces us to look into their nature. Look at Syria. These conflicts are conflicts where nobody is winning, everybody is losing. And not only everybody is losing from the point of view of the citizens of the country, the enormous suffering of the Syrian people, but we see the impact on the destabilization of the region, and we see Syria clearly as one of the feeding factors of global terrorism. Now, the point is that we need to create the conditions to make those that are parties to the conflict, but especially those that have an influence on the parties to the conflict, to understand that indeed these are conflicts where nobody is winning, everybody is losing, and in which the contradictions of interest that might interest are much smaller than the absolute need to put an end to this nonsense and to eliminate this terrible threat for our own global security. And there, as I said, we need to strengthen the capacity of the United Nations, both in conflict resolution and in preventing and sustaining peace, our new most important priority, but we will never be able to do it without a very strong support and commitment from the European Union. A strong and united Europe is an absolutely fundamental pillar of a strong and effective United Nations, and this is a very clear message I would like to address to you all. But in these conflicts, we see also horrible violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law. And that is why I would like to mention the second challenge. And it relates to the fact that we see the human rights agenda losing ground to the national sovereignty agenda. That shouldn't make sense. National sovereignty is a central pillar of the United Nations Charter, and indeed, national sovereignty is reinforced when countries are able and governments are able to protect their citizens and to preserve human rights in their territories. But unfortunately, we have seen national sovereignty many times being invoked to justify the lack of capacity of the international community to address the terrible human rights violation challenges that we see in several parts of the world. It is my belief that we need to mobilize a broader coalition for human rights, and a broader coalition able to understand that we only strengthen national sovereignty by strongly promoting and protecting human rights all over the world. But for that coalition to be effective, I think we need two conditions. First, we need to have a comprehensive view of human rights, civil and political rights, but also economic, social and cultural rights. And second, it's important not to be biased. It's important not to have double standards or either agendas. I think it's absolutely crucial to understand that human rights are invaluable in themselves, and they should not be used at the service of other political projects. And to be very frank, if we want to champion human rights, we need to have moral authority. And the recent migration and refugee crisis in the world has undermined, to a certain extent, the moral authority of several countries around the world to champion human rights in an effective way. This is why I want to say how important it is, from my perspective, the strong commitment of the European Union, together with us, in making sure that we are able to re-establish the international protection regime for refugees in line with international law, and to have Europe strongly engaged in a positive and constructive dialogue in the preparation of the global compact on safe, orderly and regular migration that I hope will be approved by the General Assembly of the United Nations in 2018. And in relation to this, I would like to make a few comments. First, it's essential that development cooperation policies are linked to our concerns about human mobility. It's essential that development cooperation policies are built in a way that allow for people to have the choice to remain in their countries, to have opportunities to be able to build their lives with dignity in their own countries, for migration to be out of choice, not out of necessity. Second, I think it is essential to have a much stronger international coordination in cracking down on traffickers and smugglers that are, in my opinion, the worst criminals of today's world. But third, I also think it's very important to create more opportunities for legal migration and more effective cooperation between countries of origin, countries of transit, and countries of destination. And I think that the European Union must be at the center of this dialogue, and your role can be extremely positive to find the necessary consensus to make the Migration Compact a success. Now, this massive displacement we are witnessing in today's world brings me to the third challenge I wanted to mention to you. And that has to do with the fact that if one looks at the global megatrends that we face, population growth, climate change, chaotic urbanization in many areas of the developing world, food insecurity, unfortunately now translated into famine in some critical areas where conflict and climate change have been allying themselves to create terrible human tragedies, water scarcity. All these megatrends are interacting with each other in a stronger and stronger way, in a world that is smaller and smaller, and they are having dramatic impacts in the increase of fragility of states, in the increase of displacement of people, and increase of human suffering in the world, and creating, in several circumstances, the potential for conflict over scarce resources. Now, in this context, it's important to recognize that climate change is the main accelerator of these factors. And being climate change the main accelerator of these factors, it is absolutely essential that the world implements the Paris Agreement and implements it with an increased ambition. And if any government doubts about this objective, that is a reason for all others to come together and make sure that we stay the course in relation to the implementation of the Paris Agreement, and that we build a broader coalition with the civil society, with the business community, with the cities, with the regions, in order to be able to make sure that our ambitions are met and that we are able to tame climate change to the benefit of our present situation, but also to the benefit of our children and grandchildren. And in relation to this, it's also important to understand that this is not only the right thing to do, this is the smart thing to do, as green business are becoming more and more recognized as good business. And those countries that will not bet in the green economy will inevitably lag behind in development in the years to come. So it's the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do, and we count on Europe to lead this effort at global level. But indeed, one of the key impacts of climate change is the acceleration of displacement, which is very much linked to the problems of migration and refugees that I mentioned. And this brings me to a fourth challenge. Globalization has had an enormous positive impact, as I mentioned, together with the technological development in relation to wealth, living conditions, the reduction of poverty, as I said in the beginning of my intervention. But globalization left a lot of people behind. And we see that in the rust belts of this world. We see that in massive youth unemployment in different parts of the world, even a little bit in Europe to a certain extent compared with other areas, but very clearly in North Africa and the Middle East, which represents a tragedy for young people, a very strong limitation for the development of the countries, but more and more, a meaningful threat for our global security. as youth without employment, without jobs, without opportunities, is becoming, in some areas of the world, one of the key areas of recruitment of terrorist groups and one of the factors that facilitate the propaganda of extremist organizations. Now, in this context, we need to recognize that globalization and technological progress also have dramatically increased inequalities at global level and at country level. 8 persons in the world have today as much wealth as half of the world population. And all these factors have contributed to undermine the trust between peoples and the political establishments at national level, but also the trust between peoples and international organizations like the UN, and the trust in global solutions for our global problems. That is the reason why I am strongly engaged in the reform of the UN, to be able to make the UN more effective, more cost-effective, but more than anything else, to make the UN closer to the aspirations, the needs, and the perspectives of the peoples we are supposed to serve. That means, for us, the reform of the UN development system, to make it much more effective in supporting member states in the implementation of the Agenda 2030, that we hope, as an agenda for sustainable development, can bring a very important contribution to re-establish that trust between peoples and the international systems, based on making sure that no one is left behind, making sure that we have a more fair globalization. At the same time, the reform of our peace strategy, operational setups and architecture, in order to make us more able to face the challenges, namely of today, peacekeeping. We have more and more peacekeeping operations where peace is elusive, and where peacekeepers see themselves in the middle of a conflict with extreme difficulties to protect the peoples they are supposed to protect. This requires a strategic analysis and new partnerships, namely with the African Union, with several African regional organizations, but very central cooperation with the European Union on these regards. And reform of our own internal management system. Some of the rules and regulations that were accumulated for decades in the UN seem to be created to make sure that we are not able to act effectively. And we need to make sure that we create the trust between member states, namely Western countries and the G77, to understand that there is a win-win solution, making the UN more flexible, but at the same time, with decentralization, simplification of procedures, with more freedom of movement of the Secretariat, at the same time with more transparency and more accountability to make sure that there is full responsibility for anything we do. Reforms essential at the level of the United Nations. I think reforms essential at the level of all international organizations, but also the understanding that we need to rebuild that trust both at country level and at global level. All our societies are becoming multi-ethnic, multicultural and multi-religious. In my opinion, this is a good thing, and I believe diversity is a richness, not a threat. But it would be naive to think that it would be naive to think that diversity will be a success automatically. For diversity to be a success, we need a massive investment, a political, social, cultural investment by governments, by local authorities, by civil societies, in the social cohesion and inclusivity of our societies. To make sure that people understand that their identities are respected, but at the same time that they belong to the community as a whole with all its rights and obligations. And at the same time, we need at global level to understand that diversity will not be automatically a source of peace and understanding. That we also need a massive investment, an investment in international cooperation to bring people together, to make people know each other, respect each other, cooperate with each other, and to do it in a way in which it's possible to have everybody working together to face the global challenges that are in front of us and that no country can solve in an isolated way. Now, it is in this context, and allow me to say a few words as a European, it is in this context that I strongly believe that the values of the Enlightenment are the most important contribution that Europe has given to world civilization. And that those values of tolerance, la primauté de la raison, those values must be a very solid cornerstone of our capacity to build a more tolerant, more fair, more just, more peaceful and more prosperous world. Thank you very much.